Have you ever met someone who smiled through unimaginable pain, only to discover they had been carrying a secret that could destroy an entire kingdom? On the night every bride dreams of, a young duchess begged her husband with trembling tears, "Please, don't look." The duke thought she was simply shy. He smiled, promised to be gentle, and reached for her trembling shoulders. But the moment her wedding gown slipped to the floor, his heart stopped. Her back was covered in scars. Not one, not two, dozens. Some looked as though they had been carved with a blade. Others had been left by burning irons. No noble woman should have carried wounds like these. Who had done this? Why had she hidden them? And why did one strange mark burned into her shoulder bear the forgotten seal of the royal family? That single discovery would pull the Duke into a conspiracy buried for nearly 20 years. A murdered queen, a stolen crown, a child everyone believed was dead, and a duchess whose scars held the truth powerful men had killed to protect. But the greatest shock was still to come, because the woman the kingdom called an ordinary duchess was never meant to be a duchess at all. She was the true heir to the throne. And before this story ends, a kingdom will burn. A false king will fall, and the scars one woman spent years trying to hide will become the very reason an empire is finally set free. This is the unforgettable story of a duchess who feared her husband would reject her, but instead discovered that one man's love could change the destiny of an entire kingdom. Before we begin, if you love emotional stories filled with mystery, romance, shocking twists, and unforgettable endings, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Now, let's begin. The kingdom of Ashmore had never witnessed a celebration quite like this. For 7 magnificent days, the kingdom seemed to forget every hardship it had ever endured. The scars of war, the empty chairs left behind by fallen soldiers, the years of uncertainty that had haunted every village. For one glorious week, they disappeared beneath music, laughter, and endless celebration. From the snow-covered mountains in the north to the golden vineyards that stretched across the southern valleys, church bells rang from sunrise until dusk. Children danced barefoot through streets decorated with thousands of colorful ribbons. Merchants closed their shops, giving away sweet bread and honey cakes to anyone passing by. Musicians played cheerful melodies in every market square, while traveling performers entertained crowds with stories of brave knights, faithful lovers, and kingdoms saved by honor. Everyone celebrated for one reason: their beloved Duke, Alexander Ravenshire, the Lion of Ashmore, the man who had defended the kingdom through 12 long years of war. The undefeated commander whose courage had become the stuff of legends. At only 32 years old, Alexander had accomplished what seasoned generals twice his age had failed to achieve. He had driven invading armies beyond the northern mountains. He had rescued entire villages from mercenary raids. He had refused every reward except the safety of his people. To the nobles, he was a military genius. To the common people, he was something even greater: hope. There wasn't a child in Ashmore who didn't pretend to be Duke Alexander while playing with wooden swords. There wasn't an old soldier who didn't proudly tell stories about fighting beside him. Even the king often admitted that without Alexander Ravenshire, the kingdom itself might not have survived. Yet despite all his victories, despite his wealth, his handsome appearance, and the countless noblewomen competing for his attention, the Duke had remained unmarried. Rumors spread throughout every corner of the kingdom. Some believed he had secretly loved a woman who died during the war. Others whispered that he intended never to marry, choosing instead to devote his life entirely to protecting Ashmore. Young noblewomen dreamed of becoming the woman who would finally melt the lion's heart. Every royal banquet became another opportunity to catch his attention. Every grand ball filled with hopeful smiles. Yet year after year, Alexander politely declined every proposal, until one quiet spring afternoon, everything changed. Without warning, the Duke announced his engagement. not to a princess from a neighboring kingdom, not to the daughter of the wealthiest duke, not even to one of the celebrated beauties who dominated every royal gathering. Instead, he chose Lady Isabella Ashcroft. The announcement stunned the entire kingdom. Many nobles exchanged confused glances. Some had barely noticed Isabella before. She rarely attended extravagant parties. She disliked gossip. She avoided political games. While other noble ladies competed for expensive jewels and admiration, Isabella could usually be found reading to orphan children, helping physicians care for wounded veterans, or quietly delivering food to struggling families without revealing her name. She never sought recognition, never demanded praise, never expected rewards. She simply believed kindness should never require an audience. That single quality had captured Alexander's attention long before she ever realized he was watching. Months earlier, disguised in plain clothing, after returning from the northern frontier, Alexander had wandered through the capital unnoticed. He wanted, for just one day, to experience life as an ordinary citizen. While walking through the marketplace, he witnessed a wealthy merchant angrily throwing an elderly woman onto the cobblestones after accusing her of stealing a loaf of bread. People stopped. They watched. No one intervened. Then a young woman stepped forward. She knelt beside the frightened old woman, helped her to her feet, and calmly paid the merchant 5 times the value of the bread. When the merchant demanded even more money, the young woman looked him directly in the eyes. "If your fortune depends on humiliating the hungry," she said softly, "then perhaps you are poorer than she is." The marketplace fell silent. The merchant lowered his gaze. Without another word, the young woman wrapped her own cloak around the trembling woman and walked away with her. Alexander stood frozen. No guards, no audience, no expectation of reward, just compassion. Later that day, he quietly asked one of his captains, "Who is she?" The captain smiled. "Lady Isabella Ashcroft." From that moment, Alexander couldn't stop noticing her. Not because she was the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, though many quietly admitted she possessed a graceful elegance. It was something else, something impossible to describe. Wherever Isabella walked, people smiled, servants relaxed, children ran toward her without fear. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered names. She thanked cooks for preparing meals. She visited injured soldiers whom even their own families had forgotten. Alexander had spent years watching people reveal their true character during war. He knew courage. He knew loyalty. He knew compassion. And Isabella possessed all 3. Months later, he asked for her hand in marriage. To everyone's surprise, she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked for 3 days. 3 long days. Many believed she simply wished to honor tradition. Only Isabella knew the truth. For those 3 days, she cried herself to sleep, because saying yes meant risking everything she had spent years hiding. And saying no meant losing the only man who had ever looked at her with genuine kindness. She chose love, even though she feared it would destroy them both. Now, their wedding day had finally arrived. Outside the magnificent cathedral of St. Aurelius, thousands of citizens filled every street. Flower petals drifted through the spring breeze. Golden banners bearing the Ravenshire crest fluttered proudly from stone towers. Trumpets echoed across the city. Inside the bridal chamber, however, there was no music, only silence. Lady Isabella stood before an enormous mirror framed in polished silver. The wedding gown surrounding her shimmered like moonlight. Delicate roses embroidered with silver thread flowed across the fabric. Tiny pearls reflected the warm glow of candlelight. Every noblewoman in Ashmore would have envied the dress. Every young girl would have dreamed of wearing it. Yet Isabella barely noticed its beauty. Her eyes remained fixed on her own reflection, not her face, not the sparkling jewels woven into her hair, but the memories hidden beneath the gown itself. Slowly, almost instinctively, her fingertips drifted toward her back. Even through layers of silk, she could almost feel them. The scars, some thin, some raised, some so deep they seemed carved directly into her soul. She closed her eyes. 10 years had passed. 10 years since she escaped the darkness. 10 years since she promised herself no one would ever see them again. Not another servant, not another physician, not another soul. And yet, before this day ended, her husband would know. The thought alone made her knees tremble. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "My lady?" Her elderly maid, Margaret, stepped quietly into the room, carrying Isabella's bouquet of white lilies. "You look absolutely beautiful." Isabella managed a faint smile. "Do I?" Margaret laughed warmly. "If the Duke doesn't faint when he sees you, I'll be terribly disappointed." For just a moment, Isabella smiled for real, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Margaret noticed. "My lady," she hesitated. "Are you frightened?" Isabella looked back toward the mirror. Her reflection stared at her like a stranger. "As ready as someone can be before losing everything." Margaret frowned. "Losing everything? Whatever do you mean?" Isabella simply shook her head. "Nothing." Because how could she possibly explain? How could she tell the woman who had cared for her for years that she wasn't afraid of marriage? She was afraid of what would happen after the wedding. When the Duke finally discovered the truth hidden beneath layers of silk, night slowly settled over Ravenshire Castle. The joyful music that had filled every hall since sunrise gradually faded into silence. One by one, the noble guests retired to their lavish chambers. The laughter disappeared. The dancing stopped. Even the servants moved quietly through the endless corridors, collecting empty wine goblets and extinguishing hundreds of candles that had illuminated the grand wedding feast. Outside, the moon hung high above the kingdom like a silver guardian. Its pale light spilled across the castle walls, bathing the ancient stone in a peaceful glow. To anyone looking from the outside, everything appeared perfect. The greatest duke in the kingdom had finally married. The future looked brighter than ever. No one could have imagined that, behind one closed door, two lives were about to change forever. Inside the duke's private chambers, silence ruled the room. A warm fire crackled gently inside an enormous marble fireplace. Golden candlelight danced across polished wooden floors. Silk curtains swayed softly as the cool evening breeze drifted through an open balcony. Fresh white lilies, placed there by the palace servants, filled the room with a delicate fragrance. Everything had been carefully prepared for the Duke and his new Duchess. Everything, except the truth. Lady Isabella stood near the large window, her hands clasped tightly together. She stared into the darkness beyond the castle gardens, but she saw nothing. Her thoughts were somewhere else, far away. Somewhere she had spent years trying to forget. Behind her, Alexander quietly removed his ceremonial sword and laid it upon its stand. For the first time in years, his shoulders relaxed. The burden of commanding armies had finally been replaced by something far gentler. Hope. He smiled as he watched his wife standing beneath the moonlight. She looked almost unreal. Her silver-white gown shimmered softly. Tiny pearls woven into her dark hair reflected the candlelight. To him, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Not because of expensive jewels, not because of noble blood, but because every time she smiled, the world somehow seemed kinder. Yet tonight, she hadn't smiled once. Throughout the wedding banquet, she had politely thanked every guest. She had greeted every noble. She had danced every required dance. But behind every graceful movement, Alexander had sensed something. Fear. Not the nervous excitement of a new bride. Something much deeper. Something heavier. He slowly walked toward her. His footsteps were quiet, gentle. He stopped only a few feet away. "You've hardly spoken all evening." Isabella forced a small smile without turning around. I've had a long day. Alexander chuckled softly. I suppose we both have. She nodded. Silence returned. Outside, an owl called somewhere beyond the gardens. Inside, only the crackling fireplace disturbed the stillness. Alexander studied her reflection in the window. Even now, she wasn't looking at him. Instead, she kept her eyes lowered, as though she feared meeting his gaze. He suddenly remembered something his mother had once told him. The bravest people are often the ones hiding the greatest pain. He wondered, what pain could Isabella possibly be hiding? He stepped closer. You don't have to be afraid. The words were spoken so gently, they barely rose above a whisper. Isabella closed her eyes. If only you knew. She wanted to say it aloud. Instead, she whispered only inside her heart. If only you knew what happens when people see what's beneath this dress. If only you knew how quickly love can become disgust. Her fingers tightened around each other, until her knuckles turned white. Alexander noticed. Very carefully. He reached for her hand. She almost pulled away. Not because she feared him. Not because she feared him. Because she feared what would happen next. His touch was warm, steady, safe, unlike any touch she had ever known. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, everything would be all right. Then reality returned. Soon, he would remove her gown. Soon, he would see. Soon, the illusion would end. Alexander smiled softly. Would you like me to help you? His voice carried no expectation, only kindness. She couldn't answer. Her throat tightened. He misunderstood her silence as nervousness. Most brides, he thought, must feel overwhelmed after such an exhausting day. Slowly, almost cautiously, he reached toward the delicate ribbons holding the back of her gown together. The instant his fingertips brushed the silk, Isabella's entire body froze. A violent tremor ran through her. Her breathing became uneven. Her eyes widened with terror. She stepped forward so suddenly that Alexander immediately withdrew his hand. I'm sorry. I frightened you. She shook her head quickly. No, it's not you. Her voice cracked. Alexander frowned. Something wasn't right. This wasn't ordinary fear. This was the fear of someone expecting pain. The realization struck him harder than he expected. Whoever had hurt Isabella had taught her to fear even kindness. His heart ached. He took another careful step forward. I would never hurt you. Those 5 words shattered something deep inside her, because she believed him, and that made everything even more painful. Tears slowly filled her eyes. She desperately tried to blink them away. She failed. The first tear slipped silently down her cheek. Alexander noticed immediately. Isabella. His voice barely escaped his lips. She turned away from him, ashamed, embarrassed, terrified. Her voice trembled. There is something you need to know. Alexander waited patiently. No pressure, no questions, only silence. She took a slow breath, then another. I almost refused your proposal. Alexander blinked. You did? She nodded. I wanted to. Not because I didn't care for you. Her tears continued falling. But because I knew this night would come. Alexander remained completely still. Listening. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, as though trying to hold together a heart already breaking apart. I've spent 10 years hiding. Every dress, every bath, every physician. I found ways to keep them from seeing. Alexander's confusion deepened. Seeing what? He wanted to ask. Instead, he waited. Because whatever burden she carried, she deserved the chance to lay it down herself. Several long moments passed. Finally, she whispered the 4 words that would forever remain etched into Alexander's memory. Please, don't look. The words were so quiet, so fragile, that they almost disappeared into the crackling fire. Alexander's heart tightened. He had expected many things tonight. Shyness, embarrassment, even coldness. But not this. Never this. He slowly stepped closer again. Not close enough to frighten her. Just close enough that she could hear every word clearly. He gently reached for her trembling hands. They were ice cold. She didn't pull away. Instead, she simply stared at the floor. "I don't understand," he spoke honestly. "But whatever you're afraid of," he squeezed her hands softly, "it won't change how I see you." Fresh tears escaped her eyes. "You don't know that. I do. You can't. I can." She slowly raised her eyes to meet his. For the first time that evening, their eyes locked. Alexander saw heartbreak, fear, exhaustion, years of carrying a burden alone. He smiled gently. "I could never hate you." Those words broke the last wall around her heart. She closed her eyes. A long silence filled the room. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached behind her neck. One ribbon, then another, then another. The elegant wedding gown slowly loosened. Her breathing became uneven. Every movement felt impossible. Every second felt like walking toward judgment. She remembered another room, another lifetime. Cold stone walls, cruel laughter. The first person who had ever seen the scars after they were made. The disgust on his face. The mocking words, "No man will ever love you now." For 10 years, those words had lived inside her mind. Tonight, she would finally learn whether they had been true. Without turning around, she whispered one final apology. "I'm sorry." Then, very slowly, she allowed the silk gown to slip from her shoulders. The room fell silent. Only the soft crackling of the fireplace could be heard. Alexander remained seated beside Isabella, the velvet blanket still wrapped gently around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The weight of everything that had happened since the wedding ceremony seemed to press against the walls of the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the castle gardens. Inside, a lifetime of buried memories waited to be released. Alexander reached for her trembling hand. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. He simply held her hand, as though silently promising that whatever she was about to say, she would never have to carry it alone again. Isabella stared into the dancing flames. For years, she had imagined this moment. Sometimes she dreamed that the man she loved would reject her. Sometimes she imagined him looking at her with disgust. Other nights, she dreamed he would never believe her story at all. Yet Alexander had done none of those things. When he saw her scars, he didn't look away. When she expected horror, he offered kindness. When she expected judgment, he covered her shoulders before asking a single question. For the first time in over a decade, she wanted to believe someone could know the truth and still remain. She inhaled slowly. "I wasn't born Lady Isabella." Alexander said nothing. His eyes never left hers. She continued quietly. "My real name," she hesitated, "was Princess Eliana." Alexander's expression changed, not because he doubted her, but because the name sounded strangely familiar. Somewhere, hidden inside distant childhood memories. He had heard that name before. He couldn't remember where. Isabella lowered her gaze. "No one has called me that in 17 years. The girl named Eliana died a long time ago." Alexander gently squeezed her hand. "No, you survived." She smiled sadly. "Sometimes surviving feels worse." Another long silence passed. The fire shifted. A log cracked loudly. Then, "At last," she began. "I was 12 years old when everything ended. 17 years earlier, Ashmore had been a very different kingdom. The streets were brighter. The people laughed more easily. The queen was loved by everyone. Queen Catherine possessed something rare among royalty. She remembered ordinary people. She visited villages without announcing her arrival. She spent afternoons speaking with wounded soldiers instead of attending endless royal banquets. Children adored her. Widows prayed for her. Even servants spoke of her kindness with tears in their eyes. To 12-year-old Eliana, she wasn't simply the queen. She was her mother. Every evening, after completing her royal lessons, Eliana would run laughing through the palace gardens, searching for Queen Catherine. Sometimes they picked roses together. Sometimes they fed the white swans swimming across the palace lake. Sometimes they escaped the endless rules of royal life altogether. On warm summer evenings, the queen would remove her jeweled crown and place wildflowers in her daughter's hair instead. "A crown tells people who you are," she would say with a smile, "but kindness tells them who you'll always be." Eliana never forgot those words. She never imagined they would become the last lesson her mother would ever teach her. The night everything changed began like every other. Rain fell softly across the palace rooftops. Thunder rolled far beyond the mountains. The king had traveled north to inspect military camps, leaving Queen Catherine to oversee affairs of state. Eliana had finished her evening lessons earlier than usual. Unable to sleep, she quietly slipped from her bedroom carrying her favorite storybook. There was a secret reading room hidden beneath the eastern wing of the palace. Very few people knew it existed. Whenever she wanted to be alone, she went there. Torchlight flickered against the ancient stone corridors beneath the palace. The underground passageways were quiet, peaceful. Eliana smiled as she skipped through the familiar tunnels. Then, she heard footsteps. Fast, desperate footsteps. Someone was running. She frowned. No one ever ran through the royal passageways. Curious. She stepped behind a marble pillar. Only moments later, she saw her mother, Queen Catherine. But something was terribly wrong. The queen's elegant gown was torn. Her breathing was uneven. One sleeve had been stained with blood. She kept looking over her shoulder in panic. "Please," the queen whispered to herself, "just a little farther." Young Eliana had never seen fear on her mother's face before. She almost stepped out from behind the pillar, almost called her name. Then she heard another sound. Heavy boots, steel armor, voices echoing through the corridor. The queen wasn't alone. She was being hunted. Eliana pressed herself tightly against the cold marble, barely daring to breathe. 4 royal guards rounded the corner. Behind them walked Lord Victor Blackthorne, the king's most trusted royal advisor. A man every noble respected. A man the kingdom believed to be honorable. The queen backed away slowly. "Victor," her voice shook. "You don't have to do this." Blackthorne smiled. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the smile of someone who had already decided another person's fate. "I'm afraid I do. The kingdom needs a different future. You swore loyalty. I swore loyalty to power." Those words echoed endlessly inside Eliana's mind. The queen looked toward the ceiling, as though silently praying someone would hear. Someone would come. No one did. With terrifying calm, Lord Blackthorne drew a dagger from beneath his cloak. Its polished blade reflected the torchlight. Queen Catherine took one final step backward. "There is still time to stop this." Blackthorne slowly shook his head. "No, there isn't." Then, without another word, he lunged forward. The dagger pierced the queen's chest. Eliana bit her own hand to stop herself from screaming. Her entire body shook violently. She watched her mother collapse onto the cold stone floor. The queen reached weakly toward the hidden pillar where her daughter stood. Their eyes met, just for one heartbreaking second. Queen Catherine didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply smiled through the pain, as if telling her daughter to stay hidden, to live. Then, her hand fell. She never moved again. The first rays of dawn had not yet touched the towers of Ravenshire Castle. The grand halls, alive with music and celebration only hours before, now lay silent beneath a blanket of darkness. Servants slept. Guests rested after the lavish wedding feast. Even the castle guards spoke only in hushed voices as they patrolled the ancient stone corridors. But one man remained awake, Duke Alexander Ravenshire. The man the kingdom called the Lion of Ashmore had faced armies that outnumbered his own 5 to 1. He had stood on blood-soaked battlefields where arrows darkened the sky. He had watched loyal friends fall beside him. He had carried dying soldiers in his arms, while enemy forces closed in from every direction. Yet none of those memories haunted him the way one image now refused to leave his mind. The scars. They were everywhere. Across Isabella's back, across her shoulders, some long and jagged, others narrow, as though carved with deliberate precision. Some carried the unmistakable marks of fire. Others had healed unevenly, leaving raised lines that no amount of time could erase. Alexander had seen countless wounds during war. Sword cuts, arrow injuries, burns from flaming siege weapons. He could identify most injuries with a single glance. But Isabella's scars, they weren't battle wounds. They weren't accidents. They told a far darker story. Someone had hurt her, not once, not during a single terrible day, for years, patiently, methodically, as though another human being had dedicated themselves to breaking a child. The realization filled him with a rage unlike anything he had ever known. Not the hot, reckless anger of a young warrior. This was colder, deeper, the kind of anger that settled silently inside a man's soul and refused to leave until justice had been served. Alexander left the castle through a side entrance. The cool morning air greeted him. Mist drifted lazily across the castle gardens. Dew clung to thousands of white roses planted by his late mother many years before. Usually, these gardens brought him peace. Today, they offered none. He walked slowly along the winding stone paths, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Every few steps he stopped, closed his eyes, and saw Isabella again, standing before him, terrified, apologizing for scars she had never deserved. He remembered the way she had whispered, "Please, don't look," not because she feared pain, because she feared rejection. Someone had convinced her that surviving made her unworthy of love. Alexander clenched his jaw. Whoever had done that had not only wounded her body, they had spent years trying to destroy her spirit. He refused to let them succeed. The eastern sky slowly turned shades of gold. Birds began singing among the ancient oak trees. The kingdom awakened. Alexander did not notice. His thoughts remained fixed on only one promise. I will find them, every last one of them. As the first sunlight touched the castle walls, Alexander returned inside, without changing his clothes, without eating breakfast, without resting even for a single moment. He summoned only one man, Captain Rowan Ashford, the commander of Ravenshire's personal guard. More importantly, Alexander's oldest friend. They had trained together as boys, fought together as men, saved each other's lives more times than either cared to count. If Alexander trusted anyone completely, it was Rowan. Only minutes later, heavy footsteps echoed through the training hall. Rowan entered wearing simple leather armor instead of ceremonial dress. His dark hair was still damp from the morning rain. He immediately noticed something was wrong. Alexander stood beside one of the enormous windows overlooking the castle courtyard. His expression remained calm, too calm. Rowan had seen that look only twice before. The first time, the northern invaders burned an entire village filled with innocent families. The second, when Alexander's younger brother died shielding wounded soldiers during the Battle of Red Hollow. Whenever Alexander became this quiet, someone usually paid a terrible price. My lord. Alexander turned. Close the doors. Rowan obeyed without asking questions. Once they were alone, Alexander spoke. What we discussed today never leaves this room. Rowan nodded immediately. You have my word. Alexander remained silent for several seconds, almost as though searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke. Someone tortured my wife. Rowan's eyes widened. What? Alexander continued. Not recently. Years ago, when she was still a child. Silence filled the room. Rowan struggled to process what he had just heard. I saw the scars myself. They weren't punishment. They weren't battle wounds. They were... Alexander's voice hardened. They were made by people who enjoyed causing pain. Rowan lowered his head. He had commanded soldiers long enough to understand what those words meant. I'm sorry. Alexander shook his head. Don't pity her. Pity the people responsible. Because I'm going to find them. And when I do... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rowan understood. Alexander stepped toward a large map covering the far wall. His finger rested upon the royal capital. Everything begins here. The palace. Rowan frowned. You believe the people responsible still serve the crown? I don't know. But Isabella's story leads back there. Alexander briefly described everything Isabella had revealed during the night. The murdered queen, the hidden prison, the missing royal documents, the years of torture, the mysterious escape. Rowan listened without interruption. When Alexander finished, the captain slowly exhaled. If even half of this is true, it means someone inside the palace has protected these crimes for years. Alexander nodded. Exactly. And whoever they are, they're still powerful. Rowan folded his arms. Then how do we proceed? Alexander's answer came instantly. Quietly. No official investigations. No royal requests. No written reports. If our enemies truly reach the palace, every question we ask will warn them. Rowan understood immediately. We investigate alone. Alexander nodded. Only those whose loyalty has already been proven. By mid-morning, their quiet investigation had already begun. Trusted riders left Ravenshire Castle, carrying sealed instructions. Not to governors, not to nobles, but to ordinary people Alexander had met throughout his military campaigns. Retired soldiers, village priests, former scouts, old healers, people who noticed details others ignored. Each received a simple request. Learn everything you can about abandoned prisons beneath the capital. Look for anyone who disappeared 17 years ago, especially children. Meanwhile, Alexander disguised himself in plain clothing, without royal banners, without guards. Without announcing his arrival, he rode toward the capital, accompanied only by Rowan. The bustling city welcomed another ordinary pair of travelers. No one recognized the famous Duke beneath his weathered cloak. That anonymity became their greatest weapon. Their first destination wasn't the palace. It was the Royal Archive, a place where every birth, every death, every prisoner, every royal decree should have been carefully recorded, or so they believed. Hours later, an elderly archivist nervously unlocked the massive oak doors. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Thousands of ancient scrolls filled endless shelves, stretching toward the ceiling. Alexander spent the entire afternoon searching. Prison records, military reports, royal decrees. Everything connected to the year Queen Catherine supposedly died from illness. Something immediately felt wrong. Entire sections had disappeared. Shelves stood empty. Record books skipped months at a time. Pages had been carefully removed, not torn, removed. Whoever erased the past had done so patiently, professionally, deliberately. Alexander exchanged a glance with Rowan. Neither man spoke. Neither needed to. Someone had already begun hiding the truth, long before Alexander ever started looking. And if the records had been destroyed, what else had vanished with them? 3 days had passed since Isabella finally revealed the truth hidden behind the scars she had carried for nearly 2 decades. Although the burden on her heart had become lighter, Her body still bore the cost of years of suffering. Every morning, the castle physician quietly visited the Duchess's chambers. Fresh herbal ointments were carefully applied to the deeper scars that had become inflamed after years of neglect. Most noble women would never allow anyone to see them in such a vulnerable state. But Alexander refused to let strangers care for his wife alone. Every evening, after the physician departed, he gently changed the bandages himself, not because he believed the physician incapable, but because every time he looked at Isabella, he silently promised himself one thing: no one will ever hurt you again. The promise became part of his daily routine. Every evening, without fail, he carried fresh linen, warm water scented with lavender, healing herbs prepared by the castle healer, and a quiet smile that slowly began replacing the fear in Isabella's eyes. For the first time in years, she no longer apologized whenever he saw her scars. Instead, she simply allowed him to help. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they sat together in silence. Alexander had learned that silence could heal wounds words never could. This evening felt no different. Rain tapped softly against the castle windows. A warm fire burned inside their private chambers. The castle itself had become unusually quiet. Most servants believed the newly married Duke and Duchess simply wished to enjoy their first peaceful days together. None of them knew that Alexander spent every spare hour secretly searching for the people responsible for Isabella's suffering. None of them knew he had quietly dispatched trusted soldiers across the kingdom, or that hidden beneath the floorboards of his private study lay maps, coded letters, and names of people who had vanished 17 years earlier. His war had already begun. Only this time, the enemy hid in the shadows. Isabella sat near the fireplace wearing a simple ivory robe. Her long dark hair rested loosely across one shoulder. She looked exhausted, but different. The fear that had once consumed every expression had begun to fade. Alexander entered carrying a wooden tray, fresh bandages, herbal medicine, a bowl of warm water. She smiled gently. "You never let the servants do this anymore." He returned the smile. "They've already done enough." She laughed quietly. "And my Duke insists on becoming my physician. I make no promises about my medical skills. But I'm determined to become excellent at changing bandages." She couldn't help smiling. A month ago, she would never have believed she could laugh again. Alexander placed the tray beside her. "May I?" She nodded. Carefully, he untied the linen wrapped around her shoulder. Every movement remained slow, deliberate. He never rushed, never stared, never treated the scars as something ugly. To Alexander, they were not marks of shame. They were proof she had survived. The old bandage came away. He dipped a clean cloth into the warm herbal water, gently cleaned the healing wound. Neither of them spoke. Outside, rain continued falling softly. Inside, only the sound of crackling fire filled the room. Then, Alexander paused. His hand froze. Something caught his attention. At first he believed it was simply another scar, hidden beneath older ones. But as he carefully wiped away the last traces of ointment, a strange shape slowly appeared beneath the scar tissue. Not a cut, not a burn, something else entirely. He leaned closer. His heartbeat slowed. The symbol was small, barely larger than a coin. Time had faded much of it. Scar tissue covered parts of the edges. Yet its design remained unmistakable. A crown, surrounded by 7 perfectly arranged stars. Alexander stopped breathing. He had seen that symbol before. Only once. Years ago. Inside the royal archives. His fingers tightened slightly around the cloth. Impossible. His mind immediately rejected the thought. There had to be another explanation. Perhaps it belonged to an ancient noble family. Perhaps someone had copied the design. Perhaps. He looked again. Number. Every detail matched perfectly. The 7 stars, the shape of the crown, even the tiny circle beneath its base. There could be no mistake. Isabella noticed the sudden silence. She turned slightly. "What is it?" Alexander quickly composed himself. "Nothing." She studied his face. "You've never been very good at pretending." He smiled weakly. "Have I become that easy to read?" She nodded. "When you worry, you stop blinking." Despite the seriousness of the moment, Alexander laughed softly. "You've been observing me." "I've had time." The smile faded from his face almost immediately. Very gently, he touched the edge of the strange mark. "Isabella, have you ever noticed this?" She frowned. "What?" "This symbol." She twisted carefully, trying to look over her shoulder. "I've never seen it. I've never looked." Alexander understood. After years of hiding her scars, she had avoided mirrors completely. The less she saw them, the easier it became to pretend they weren't there. He reached for a small silver mirror resting upon the dressing table. Carefully, he angled it so she could see the upper part of her shoulder. For the first time, Isabella noticed the mark. She stared silently. I didn't know it was there." Alexander nodded slowly. "Neither did I." She traced the edge of the brand with trembling fingers. "It isn't a scar. No. It was burned into the skin." Her breathing became uneven. "Do you know what it means?" Alexander hesitated. "I think I do." Her eyes met his. "What is it?" He remained silent for several long seconds, then quietly answered, "I pray I'm wrong." That night, long after Isabella had fallen asleep, Alexander stood alone inside his private study. The old leather-bound journal he had borrowed from the royal archives lay open across his desk. He turned page after page beneath the glow of a single candle. Ancient family crests, royal bloodlines, forgotten noble houses. His eyes searched desperately. Then, near the center of one faded page, he found it. The same crown. The same 7 stars. His heart pounded. Beneath the illustration, written in faded ink older than a century, were the words, "The sacred mark of the House of Aurelius, bestowed only upon children born directly into the royal bloodline. Its use beyond the reigning family is punishable by death." Alexander slowly lowered the book. His hands trembled. Only one family in the entire kingdom had ever carried that mark. The royal family. No duke. No count. No noble house. Only the king's direct descendants. He stared into the candle flame. His thoughts raced. If Isabella carried this mark, then everything she believed about herself, everything the kingdom believed, everything written in the official histories, could all be a lie. And if someone had branded, or concealed, that symbol beneath years of torture, perhaps those scars had never been intended merely to punish her. Perhaps they had been meant to hide who she truly was. Alexander suddenly understood why someone had erased records, why witnesses had disappeared, why former prison guards had been murdered. Someone wasn't protecting a murder. They were protecting a stolen throne. His eyes slowly lifted toward the darkness beyond the castle window. One terrifying question echoed through his mind. Who is my wife, really?